The Clock That Slowed Down Time. Episode 1. When Seconds Refused to Obey. No one noticed the clock misbehaving at first. That was the strange part. On the morning of April 18th, 1906, the same morning San Francisco would tear itself apart, time had already begun to slip, quietly, politely, without spectacle. Seconds stretched like warm taffy. Minutes loosened their grip, and in a small, soot-stained workshop 3 blocks from Market Street, a clockmaker named Elias Whitcomb felt it before the earth ever moved. He did not feel fear. He felt delay. The tick of the brass pendulum in front of him came half a breath late, then another. Not broken, not stuck, just slower, as if the air itself had thickened. Elias leaned closer to the open case. His magnifying loupe trembled slightly against his right eye, not from age, but from the sensation that something deeply familiar had shifted out of alignment. "Don't do that," he whispered, as if the clock could hear him. It ticked again, late. Outside, horses stomped, cable cars rattled, somewhere a milk bottle shattered. The city behaved exactly as it always had, unaware that the machinery beneath modern life, the invisible agreement of time itself, had begun to hesitate. At 5:12 a.m., the earth snapped, but by then, time had already been bending for nearly 7 minutes. Elias Whitcomb had come to America with 3 things: a German apprenticeship certificate in horology, a tin photograph of his mother standing beside a black forest clock taller than she was, and an almost religious belief that time was not abstract, it was mechanical, temperamental, and capable of being wrong. Born in Furtwangen, Baden, in 1861, Elias grew up in a region where time was not told, it was carved. The Black Forest clockmakers did not speak of hours poetically. They spoke of tolerances, escapements, thermal expansion, friction losses. Elias learned early that clocks lied under pressure. Heat made brass swell, cold stiffened oil, altitude altered swing rates. Even the moon, through tides and temperature, nudged accuracy. By the time he arrived at Ellis Island in 1887, Elias was already convinced that time was less a river and more a machine that required constant correction. America loved machines. America in the late 19th century was obsessed with speed, railroads, telegraphs, factory belts, steam whistles, but it was also obsessed with synchronization. Before 1883, every town in the United States kept its own time. Noon meant when the sun was overhead, not when a watch said so. That chaos nearly killed the railroads, so the railroads killed local time instead. On November 18, 1883, later called the Day of Two Noons, railroad companies imposed standardized time zones across the nation. The government followed later. Clocks were forced to agree. Elias watched this happen with fascination and quiet dread, because agreement was not the same as truth. By 1906, Elias Whitcomb ran a modest clock and instrument repair shop in San Francisco. He serviced maritime chronometers for Pacific shipping companies, repaired regulator clocks for banks, and occasionally, quietly, consulted for engineers who needed time measurements more precise than public clocks could offer. His shop smelled of oil, ozone, and old wood. On the walls hung instruments that did not belong to the future, but refused to leave the present. Sextants, pendulum regulators, a battered marine chronometer once used on a whaling ship out of New Bedford. The clock that misbehaved that morning was none of these. It was a prototype. Elias had built it over 6 years using scrap brass, German steel springs, and an idea he had never written down. It had no name, only a small engraving on the inside plate, Delta Time. Delta Time. The idea was simple enough to sound foolish, a clock that compensated not just for temperature and friction, but for environmental stress itself, vibration, pressure, magnetic disturbance. Elias believed timekeeping errors weren't random, they clustered around moments of stress. Earthquakes, explosions, industrial strain. History, he noticed, had a rhythm. The night before April 18th, Elias had calibrated delta time to perfection. It had lost less than 1/10 of a second in 72 hours, an astonishing figure for a non-atomic device decades before atomic clocks existed. Then, just before dawn, it slowed. Not stopped, not failed, it hesitated. And Elias, against all reason, felt the hesitation in his bones. When the earthquake struck, Elias was thrown against his workbench. Glass shattered, the pendulum of delta time swung wildly, then settled. Outside, brick collapsed like sand. Fires ignited in 6 directions at once. San Francisco would burn for 3 days, but Elias was not watching the city. He was watching the clock. After the shaking stopped, he pulled himself upright, coughing plaster dust. Delta time still ticked, but it was now exactly 7 minutes behind every other functioning timepiece in the shop. 7 minutes. The same amount of time Elias later calculated had passed between delta time's first hesitation and the main shock. He did not report this. He did not tell anyone. Instead, he wrote a single sentence in a leather-bound notebook he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Time reacted before matter did. In the weeks after the earthquake, the United States entered a period of quiet panic. Insurance companies collapsed, seismology became a serious science overnight. Engineers debated whether disasters could be predicted. Most concluded no. Elias disagreed. And somewhere far away in Washington, D.C., a clerk in the U.S. Naval Observatory noticed a discrepancy. Several marine chronometers, recently serviced in San Francisco, had reported minor but identical timing deviations just before the earthquake. The deviation was small, but it was consistent, and consistency in timekeeping was never accidental. By the end of 1906, Elias Whitcomb would receive a letter marked Official Confidential, inviting him to consult on a matter of national technical interest. By 1908, he would be working behind locked doors. By 1917, his clock would be classified. And by 1921, the phrase temporal drag would appear once, briefly, in a document that would vanish from public record for nearly a century. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, Elias stood in a ruined city, staring at a clock that had slowed down before history cracked open. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid, not of the future, but of what time itself might be trying to warn him about. Episode 2: The Observatory That Measured Silence. The letter arrived folded too precisely to be casual. Elias Whitcomb noticed that first. The paper was thick, government stock, watermarked faintly with an eagle so pale it only appeared when held to the window. The envelope bore no return address, only his name, spelled correctly, in a hand that valued uniformity over elegance. He did not open it immediately. Experience had taught Elias that messages involving time rarely benefited from haste. He waited until dusk, when the rebuilt city quieted into its post-disaster fatigue. San Francisco was still bleeding smoke months after the earthquake. Temporary buildings leaned like exhausted men. Time here had become elastic in a different way. Days blurred, nights lengthened, grief ignored clocks altogether. When Elias finally broke the seal, the language inside was polite, clinical, and deeply unnatural. Mr. Whitcomb, your expertise in precision horology and maritime chronometry has been brought to our attention. The United States Naval Observatory requests your temporary consultation regarding an anomaly observed in several regulated instruments. Travel arrangements enclosed. This matter is not classified, but discretion is expected. Not classified. That phrase, Elias knew, meant the opposite of harmless. The United States Naval Observatory, perched on Observatory Circle in Washington, D.C., was not a place that welcomed uncertainty. Founded in 1830 to improve navigation accuracy, it had become the nation's unofficial keeper of time. Every railroad, every ship's chronometer, every telegraph signal ultimately bowed to the observatory's measurements. It was here that America decided what now meant. When Elias arrived in early February 1907, the grounds were quiet in the way only scientific institutions could be. Orderly, insulated, slightly arrogant. Snow dusted the domes. Inside, hallways smelled of ink, oil, and heated metal. He was led not to an office, but to a basement room without windows. 3 men waited. Commander Edwin Hale, U.S. Navy, tall and impatient, Dr. Francis Loomis, astronomer, thin like a clock hand, and a civilian whose name Elias would not learn for 2 years. The clocks were already ticking when he entered. They showed him the data without ceremony. Rows of figures, observation logs, telegraph synchronization records, before and after timestamps. Elias scanned them silently, his finger tracing columns as if reading Braille. These chronometers, Hale said, tapping the table, were serviced in San Francisco. Yes, Elias replied, by me. And they all reported a negative deviation prior to April 18th, within a margin too consistent to be coincidence. How large? Elias asked. Loomis hesitated. 7 minutes, Hale said, flatly. Elias closed his eyes. So Delta T had not been alone. The observatory had first noticed the discrepancy because of stellar transit observations. Every night, astronomers recorded the exact moment specific stars crossed predefined meridian lines. These transits were the backbone of accurate timekeeping. On April 18, 1906, several observations from the Pacific Fleet did not align. The stars were early, or rather, the clocks were late. Initially, officials blamed instrument damage from the earthquake, but when they traced the servicing records, a pattern emerged. The chronometers had been stable until hours before the quake. Then, slippage. Elias felt a tightening in his chest. Did you notice anything unusual? Hale asked. Yes, Elias said. The room stiffened. I built a clock, he continued carefully, that exhibited the same behavior. Silence followed. Loomis leaned forward. You built a clock that predicted the earthquake. No, Elias said, it reacted before it. The civilian man smiled for the first time. They gave Elias a workspace 2 levels below the main observatory floor. There were no windows, the walls were thick stone, the air barely moved. On the bench waited instruments he recognized, and others he did not. Most unsettling was the absence of sound. Even the clocks ticked softly, muffled by design. Here, Elias learned the observatory's secret. For decades, they had noticed anomalies during moments of national strain. Wars, industrial accidents, mass power failures. Time discrepancies were rare, subtle, and dismissed individually. But when viewed together, they formed a pattern that no one wanted to name. During the Battle of Manila Bay in 1998, naval chronometers briefly lost synchronization. During the Johnstown flood of 1889, a telegraph time signal arrived fractions of a second late across multiple states. During massive steel pours, large-scale explosions, or rail collisions, clocks did not fail but hesitated. The observatory called these events measurement noise. Elias called them something else. Stress, he said, not mechanical, environmental, collective. You're saying time responds to human activity? Hale scoffed. No, Elias replied. I'm saying time responds to stress in matter. Humans are just very good at creating it. They allowed him to bring Delta T from San Francisco. The clock arrived in a padded crate under armed escort. Elias set it on the bench and opened the case. Inside, Delta T looked ordinary. Brass plates, steel pivots, a temperature-compensated pendulum. Nothing about it screamed revolution. The innovation was not visible. It was in the tolerances, the way the components breathed. They began tests immediately. Vibration tables, pressure chambers, magnetic fields. Delta T behaved beautifully, adjusting, correcting, maintaining accuracy better than any mechanical clock the observatory had ever seen. Then came the test they did not document. They synchronized Delta T with the observatory's master clock. At precisely 11:40 p.m., Hale ordered a controlled detonation at a quarry 12 miles outside the city, a routine military blast, logged and measured. When the shockwave reached Washington, the buildings did not shake, but Delta T slowed. Not by seconds, by 300 milliseconds. The master clock did not. Elias felt lightheaded. Again, the civilian said quietly. They repeated the experiment 4 times over the next month. Every time, Delta T hesitated slightly before seismic sensors registered the disturbance. Not prediction, anticipation, as if time itself felt the stress approaching and braced. Loomis stopped calling it noise. Hale stopped laughing. The civilian finally introduced himself as Arthur Bell, from a department that officially did not exist. What happens, Bell asked one night, if enough stress accumulates? Elias stared at the pendulum's steady swing. I don't know, he said, but I think we're already finding out. In 1914, Europe exploded. The United States stayed officially neutral, but its factories did not. Steel production surged, rail lines ran day and night, shipyards thundered. At the observatory, clocks began to misbehave, again. Not much, not enough to alarm the public, but enough. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, artillery testing along the East Coast caused time discrepancies measurable only by Delta T and its successors. Elias helped build more. They were never called clocks. They were called regulators. By the war's end, 3 existed. By 1919, Elias noticed something worse. The delays were lasting longer. Time wasn't snapping back immediately anymore. It was dragging. On June 28, 1919, Elias wrote in his notebook, "We measure time as if it were passive. I believe it is reactive. If stress continues to accumulate faster than it can dissipate, time itself may lose coherence." He did not share this. The observatory buried the data. America wanted peace, and peace, Elias feared, was about to become very loud. Episode 3. The Years That Took Too Long. The war ended, but time did not recover. That was the first thing Elias Whitcomb understood, though it took years to prove. In November of 1918, church bells rang across the United States. Factories fell quiet. Young men came home older than their fathers. Officially, the nation exhaled. The newspapers called it relief. But inside the basement rooms of the U.S. Naval Observatory, the regulators told a different story. They did not return to baseline. Not fully. The delays, once sharp and momentary, now lingered like heat trapped in metal. Milliseconds stretched into tenths of a second. Tenths accumulated into seconds over weeks. The master clock required constant correction, not because it was wrong, but because the world around it seemed reluctant to move at the expected pace. Elias did not say this out loud. He learned over time which ideas were permitted to exist only on paper. America in the 1920s was a nation obsessed with speed. Automobiles replaced horses, assembly lines replaced craftsmen, radios collapsed distance into sound. The country measured progress in miles per hour and units per minute. Efficiency experts timed workers with stopwatches, convinced that time was infinite so long as it could be divided. Elias watched this acceleration with unease. The regulators reacted to it. Large-scale steel production caused minor temporal drag. Major bridge projects, especially those involving deep foundations and massive vibrations, produced measurable effects. The construction of the Holland Tunnel under the Hudson River registered as a prolonged disturbance, subtle but unmistakable. Time did not break, it strained. In 1921, a memorandum circulated briefly among observatory staff before disappearing into restricted archives. Elias read it once. It contained a phrase he would never forget: temporal inertia. The idea was simple and terrifying. If time resisted sudden change, then sustained pressure might deform it. The clocks were no longer misbehaving, they were responding. Elias aged quietly. By the mid-1920s, his hair thinned, his hands stiffened in winter, but his mind sharpened. He no longer thought like a clockmaker, he thought like a listener. He listened to time. The regulators, now improved and refined, sat in temperature-controlled vaults. They were not impressive machines, no grand faces, no public displays. They were silent witnesses, comparing the expected rhythm of the universe with what actually occurred. And what occurred, increasingly, was delay. Elias began correlating data beyond official reports: industrial output, power consumption, rail freight volume, population density, urban noise. The correlations frightened him. Cities dragged time more than countryside, factories more than fields, war more than peace, and mass panic more than any machine ever could. Then came October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday. When the stock market collapsed, it did so loudly, shouting headlines, screaming tickers, men gesturing wildly on the trading floor. The nation remembers the noise. Elias remembers the quiet. At the observatory, the regulators slowed for nearly 6 minutes, not abruptly, but gradually, like a man lowering himself into cold water. Telegraph signals arrived late across financial hubs, not enough to disrupt trades, just enough to confuse them. Clerks blamed human error, engineers blamed line interference. Elias blamed fear. For the first time, he wrote a sentence he would later regret: collective human stress may deform time more effectively than physical force. That sentence would never leave his notebook. The Great Depression stretched years thin. To the public, it felt endless. Days blurred, hope receded, time lost texture. To the regulators, it felt heavy. Time became viscous. Corrections were constant, deviations persistent. The master clock could no longer be trusted to drift naturally. It required intervention to stay aligned with astronomical observations. Elias, now in his 70s, began to feel it personally. His mornings felt shorter, but his afternoons endless. Memory behaved oddly. Recent events felt distant, distant events sharp and present. He suspected this was not aging, it was immersion. He was living inside altered time. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated. Hope returned, cautiously. The New Deal mobilized the nation again. Dams, roads, power grids, enormous undertakings, enormous stress. The regulators reacted. The construction of the Hoover Dam registered as the longest continuous temporal drag event Elias had ever recorded. Not a spike, a sustained deformation lasting months. Time did not slow dramatically, it thickened. Elias, now in his 70s, began to feel it personally. His mornings felt shorter, but his afternoons endless. Memory behaved oddly. Recent events felt distant, distant events sharp and present. He suspected this was not aging, it was immersion. He was living inside altered time. In 1939, Europe caught fire again. By 1941, so did America. Pearl Harbor registered on the regulators before the news reached Washington. Not minutes, milliseconds, but enough. World War II dwarfed the first in every measurable way.
Industrial output exploded, cities vibrated constantly, the Earth itself seemed under siege. Time responded. The regulators slowed repeatedly, sometimes unpredictably. For the first time, Elias recorded temporal overlap, brief moments when clocks disagreed not by lag, but by sequence. Events appeared slightly out of order. Nothing dramatic, nothing provable, enough to keep him awake. In 1945, Elias Whitcomb died quietly in his sleep, or at least that's what the official record says. The regulators did something strange that night. They stopped slowing. They did not speed up. They held, as if listening, as if waiting. Arthur Bell returned 2 days later. He ordered Elias's notebooks confiscated. Most were destroyed. One was misfiled. Inside it was a final entry written in a trembling hand. Time does not flow, it negotiates, and we have been terrible negotiators. The atomic age began. Time would never forgive it.
Episode 4. The day time jumped. Time did not scream when the first atomic bomb detonated. It did not fracture audibly or collapse into chaos. There was no cosmic shudder, no visible ripple in the sky. If anything, time reacted the way a living thing does when struck somewhere deep and vital. It flinched. At 5:29:45 a.m. Mountain War Time, July 16, 1945, in the Jornada del Muerto Desert of New Mexico, the United States detonated the first nuclear device in human history, the Trinity test. The world remembers the light. The clocks remember something else. At the U.S. Naval Observatory, the master clock was synchronized to astronomical time as usual. Atomic clocks did not yet exist. Time was still measured by stars, pendulums, and faith in consistency. But several newly installed quartz oscillators, experimental, sensitive, and unforgiving, behaved strangely. They did not slow. They jumped by an average of plus 2.7 milliseconds forward. For the first time since measurements began, time advanced ahead of expectation. Not drift, not delay, acceleration. The logs were amended, the data classified, and the phenomenon was never officially acknowledged. Arthur Bell read the report twice, then a third time. He had outlived Elias Whitcomb, Loomis, Hale, and nearly everyone who had witnessed the early years of temporal drag. Bell himself was an old man now, sustained by secrets and the peculiar longevity that comes from living slightly off the official timeline. He knew what the jump meant. Time was no longer merely reacting, it was defending itself. The Manhattan Project had not consulted the Naval Observatory. Physicists did not ask clocks for permission. The bomb was justified as necessity, as ending a war, as preserving lives. None of that mattered to time. What mattered was scale. Never before had humanity released so much energy in so little space. The regulators, now improved descendants of Elias's Delta T, registered shockwaves not only through matter, but through duration itself. The shock was brief, but it left scars. In the months that followed, the observatory recorded a new phenomenon, temporal ringing. Like a struck bell, time oscillated after major atomic tests. Small fluctuations, microseconds forward then backward, settled slowly over hours or days. At first, officials blamed instrumentation errors. Then the pattern repeated. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, later tests in the Pacific. Each produced the same signature. Bell convened a meeting. It was not recorded. The conclusion was simple and unsettling. Time had limits. The post-war years brought atomic optimism, power plants, medical isotopes, consumer confidence. Suburban clocks ticked cheerfully on kitchen walls. Underneath, time was no longer smooth. The observatory's internal documents began using a new phrase, temporal fatigue. The idea was theoretical, unprovable, and therefore dangerous. If time could be stressed repeatedly without sufficient recovery, then future disturbances might behave unpredictably. No one knew what unpredictably meant.
Arthur Bell authorized the creation of a new program. Its name was deliberately dull: Project Stillness. Project Stillness was not about stopping time, it was about calming it. The premise borrowed from Elias Whitcomb's earliest insight: stress accumulated, therefore stress might be dissipated. They experimented quietly, limiting synchronized detonations, spacing out large-scale tests, even proposing, briefly, that cities reduce certain industrial activities during known periods of temporal instability. That proposal died immediately. Time, it turned out, had no lobby. In 1952, something happened that forced Bell to act. The first hydrogen bomb, Ivy Mike, detonated in the Pacific. Its yield dwarfed Hiroshima. The regulators did not jump, they froze. For 1.4 seconds, the clocks disagreed entirely. Some advanced, some delayed, some recorded no passage at all. Astronomical observations during that window failed. Stars appeared where they should not be, not visibly to the naked eye, but measurably, enough to terrify the men who understood what they were seeing. Time had lost coherence. After that, Bell stopped asking for permission. Project Stillness expanded. New facilities were built underground, far from cities, where regulators could operate in controlled silence. Sensitive populations, scientists, analysts, certain government officials, were quietly rotated to avoid prolonged exposure during periods of instability. No one used the word shelter, but that is what it was. The public noticed nothing. Life continued. Television shows aired on schedule. Children grew. But some people began reporting odd experiences, moments repeating, déjà vu with timestamps, clocks disagreeing briefly before correcting themselves. Most were dismissed as stress. Bell knew better. Time was no longer just slowing, it was learning. By the late 1950s, Project Stillness produced a report Bell refused to sign. It proposed that time behaved like a compressible medium. Under sufficient pressure, it did not break, it redistributed, which meant some places might experience time differently than others. Localized dilation, localized acceleration, localized loss. Bell burned the report. The idea survived anyway. In 1961, the first human left Earth. Yuri Gagarin orbited the planet. Time behaved. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world within inches of annihilation. Time held its breath. The regulators slowed so severely that manual correction failed. For hours, the observatory could not reconcile astronomical observations with mechanical readings. When the crisis passed, time surged forward slightly, recovering lost ground. Bell wrote a single line in the margin of a classified memo: "Time prefers survival." Arthur Bell retired in 1963. Project Stillness did not. It changed names, changed buildings, changed oversight. Time was now considered a strategic variable. In 1969, men walked on the moon. Atomic clocks flew with them. Time behaved again. For a while. But something Elias Whitcomb had never predicted was about to emerge. Not from war, not from industry, but from information.
Episode 5. When speed became pressure. Atomic clocks were supposed to end the argument. That was the promise. When the first cesium atomic clock went online at the National Bureau of Standards in 1955, it measured time not by gears, stars, or pendulums, but by the vibration of atoms themselves. This was time stripped of interpretation, pure, fundamental, absolute. At least, that was the theory. Project Stillness watched closely. For the first time, timekeeping had moved beyond approximation. The second was no longer something observed, it was defined. 9,192,631,770 oscillations of cesium-133. Unquestionable. Or so it seemed. The early atomic clocks were astonishingly precise, but they were also unforgiving. They exposed discrepancies that older systems had smoothed over. Suddenly, small inconsistencies appeared everywhere.
Time gained at altitude, time lost near mass. Relativity, once theoretical, became operational. Engineers adjusted, scientists recalibrated. Time, once again, complied. But only on paper. By the 1960s, Project Stillness noticed something unsettling. Atomic clocks agreed with each other perfectly until placed in environments of extreme informational throughput. This was new. High-speed data processing centers, early satellite relay hubs, military command facilities humming with continuous computation. In those places, atomic clocks required correction more often, not because they were wrong, because they were being asked to define time faster than time wanted to be defined. Elias Whitcomb had measured stress in vibration and force. The atomic age had measured energy in energy. Now a new form emerged: cognitive load. Humanity was no longer just moving matter faster, it was thinking faster. The 1970s brought microprocessors, the 1980s brought networks, the 1990s brought the internet. And with them, time fractured into packets. Every email, every transaction, every digital heartbeat demanded synchronization. Servers spoke to servers, markets reacted in milliseconds. The world no longer moved together, it updated. Project Stillness was rebranded quietly within the Department of Defense. It gained a new focus: latency anomalies. Networks occasionally behaved as if time itself had hiccuped. Signals arrived early or late without explanation. Engineers blamed routing errors. The anomalies clustered around major events: market crashes, wars broadcast live, moments of mass attention. Time was reacting not to machines, but to collective awareness. In 1987, on Black Monday, when global markets collapsed in hours, atomic clocks at financial hubs recorded micro-deviations, not enough to disrupt systems, but enough to leave fingerprints. In 2001, on September 11th, something unprecedented happened. When the second plane hit the South Tower, network time servers across the northeastern United States registered a simultaneous correction event. Time slowed, not locally, regionally. For 2.3 seconds, synchronization protocols struggled to agree on now. The data was classified within hours. The public felt something else, a stretching, a sense that those moments lasted longer than they should have. They were right. Project Stillness expanded its models. Stress was no longer just physical or energetic. It was informational density multiplied by emotional intensity. The equation was horrifyingly simple. The faster humanity processed reality, the more pressure it applied to time. By the early 2000s, another phenomenon appeared: temporal compression. People everywhere reported the same feeling. Years passed faster than childhood days ever had. Holidays arrived too soon. Memory blurred. Time felt thin. Atomic clocks showed no error, but subjective time, the human experience of duration, was collapsing. Project Stillness realized the mistake. They had been measuring time's structure, not its experience. In 2012, an internal report proposed something radical. Time was not uniform, it existed in layers. Fundamental time, the kind atoms obeyed, remained stable. Human time, the kind consciousness experienced, was elastic, and the interface between them was under unprecedented strain. Digital life had eliminated natural pauses. No silence, no darkness, no waiting. Time never recovered between moments. In 2020, the world stopped. For the first time in modern history, industrial activity dropped globally. Air traffic halted, streets emptied, factories slowed. Project Stillness watched in disbelief. The regulators stabilized. For weeks, temporal drag eased. Time breathed. People noticed. Days felt strange, long and short at once. Then activity resumed. Time tightened again. By 2023, atomic clocks began recording something no model predicted. The Earth's rotation sped up. Not much, milliseconds, but enough that leap seconds were questioned for the first time. Time was no longer just slowing, it was compensating, as if correcting imbalance. A young analyst in Project Stillness wrote a sentence that echoed Elias Whitcomb a century. Time is not failing, it is adapting. The report was marked sensitive, and outside classified rooms, people began saying the same thing in simpler words. Time feels weird lately. The clocks were listening, and they were not done responding.
Episode 6, The Experiment Nobody Approved. The first attempt to slow time on purpose was not announced. There was no press release, no executive order, no public debate. It began the way most consequential mistakes do, inside a conference room with coffee gone cold and a deadline no one had chosen. Project Stillness had run out of explanations. For over a century, they had measured time's reactions to human stress. War, industry, information, fear, each left fingerprints. The data was clear. The models converged. Time resisted compression, and resistance, left unmanaged, became instability. So the question changed. Not what is time doing, but what can we do to time? The proposal arrived in 2026. It was framed as infrastructure, not temporal manipulation, not control, stabilization. The idea borrowed from physics, psychology, and urban planning all at once. If stress caused time to deform, then reducing stress, artificially, locally, might allow time to relax. Not globally, that would be impossible, but locally, maybe. The plan was simple enough to pass initial review. Select a contained environment, reduce informational throughput, limit sensory load, control electromagnetic noise, suppress rapid decision cycles, create, in effect, a low-tempo zone, then observe the clocks. They chose a place that would not be missed, a decommissioned Cold War listening station in the Nevada desert. No population, no headlines, no reason for attention. The station had thick concrete walls, deep underground rooms, and a long history of silence. Once, it had listened for Soviet signals. Now, it would listen to time. The regulators were installed first. Atomic, mechanical, hybrid systems descended conceptually from Elias Whitcomb's Delta T. They synchronized the clocks. Then they began subtracting speed. Power was throttled, network connections severed, no wireless signals permitted, human presence limited to slow rotations of staff trained specifically not to hurry. There were no deadlines inside the facility, no real-time news, no external synchronization for hours at a time. Time, for the first few days, behaved normally. Then something shifted. On day 11, the regulators diverged, not randomly, consistently. Inside the station, clocks ran slower than external reference time, not by seconds, by fractions, but the difference accumulated. By day 21, inside time lagged external time by nearly 9 seconds. The staff noticed first. Meals felt longer, conversations stretched, sleep deepened, memory sharpened. No one panicked. That came later. Project Stillness ran checks. No relativistic effects, no gravitational anomalies, no power fluctuations. Time itself appeared to be experiencing reduced pressure. For the first time, Elias Whitcomb's theory had been reversed. Time was not reacting, it was recovering. Then came the ethical objection. If time could be slowed locally, then access to that slowed time became power. 9 seconds per month became minutes per year. Minutes became hours. Hours became advantage. The proposal to scale the experiment was rejected. Officially. Unofficially, data continued to be collected. The first anomaly occurred on day 36. A technician exited the station after a 48-hour shift. Outside, his watch disagreed with the world by nearly a minute. Medical evaluation found nothing wrong. Psychological testing showed enhanced focus. Reaction times were faster. He had lived more time than he had spent. Word spread quietly. Requests followed. What if surgeons operated inside? What if pilots trained inside? What if decision-makers lived inside? Project Stillness denied everything.
then approved a second site. The second site was smaller, urban, disguised. Time slowed more quickly there because stress outside was higher. The contrast sharpened the effect. By 2031, something unexpected happened. The regulators inside the first station stopped slowing. They stabilized. Time inside had found equilibrium. Outside, time continued accelerating. The gap widened. Time was no longer uniform across human civilization. It had fractured. A report circulated with a red cover and no author. We have created temporal inequality. Those inside experienced longer lives. Those outside felt time slipping away. No law addressed this. No treaty covered it. Time had become a resource. Then came the incident. A staff member stayed too long. When he exited, his body adjusted too quickly. Disorientation, cardiac stress. He survived, barely. Time, it seemed, did not like abrupt transitions. Project Stillness halted expansion. Too late. The idea had escaped. Corporations asked questions. Governments listened. And somewhere in the archives, Elias Whitcomb's misfiled notebook was rediscovered. One sentence circled in red. Time does not flow, it negotiates. The negotiation had begun.
Episode 7. The Price of Extra Time. Time inequality did not announce itself with violence. It crept in through optimization. At first, the facilities were described in harmless language: focus environments, cognitive recovery zones, high-stability research centers. Nothing about time appeared in public documents. Nothing needed to. Those inside noticed. They noticed that days felt full again, that work ended without exhaustion, that memory held its shape, that aging seemed gentler. Those outside noticed something else. Everything was speeding up. By the mid-2030s, the gap was impossible to ignore. Executives rotated through quiet campuses and returned sharper, calmer, strangely rested. Political leaders aged slowly on camera. Scientists published at a pace that defied burnout. Meanwhile, the general public complained of lost years. Birthdays arrived too fast. Children grew up abruptly. Old age felt rushed. No one used the phrase time theft yet, but they felt it. Project Stillness fractured under the pressure. Officially, it was dissolved. Unofficially, its people scattered into private firms, defense contractors, and research institutions with vague mandates and deep budgets. Time stabilization became proprietary, and anything proprietary invites competition. The first lawsuit was filed in 2037. It was dismissed immediately. Time, the court ruled, was not a measurable harm under existing statutes. The judge retired 6 months later. He entered a facility shortly after. The first protest occurred in Chicago. The signs were confused. "Stop stealing our time. We're aging faster than you. Who owns the clock?" Police dispersed the crowd. The clocks inside government buildings remained perfectly synchronized. Outside, watches disagreed briefly, then corrected. No one noticed. By 2040, time-based language entered politics. Candidates promised to slow things down. Opponents accused them of hoarding hours. Policy papers referenced temporal equity without defining it. The public felt the truth without vocabulary. Life was accelerating unevenly. Then came the leak. A mid-level engineer released internal logs showing differential aging rates between stabilized and unstabilized populations. Not dramatic, but undeniable. Those with access to stabilized time experienced approximately 3 to 4% more subjective duration per calendar year. Over a lifetime, that was decades. The story broke globally. It could not be unlearned. Governments denied intent. Corporations cited wellness. Scientists avoided interviews. The clocks said nothing.
In 2042, the first violent incident occurred. A stabilized facility in Arizona was breached. No one was killed, but the regulators were destroyed. When the system collapsed, time surged back. Inside, people collapsed. Some aged visibly within minutes. Others lost consciousness. A few never woke up. Time reclaimed its debt. Public reaction hardened. Access to slowed time was no longer seen as a privilege. It was seen as theft from the future. An emergency summit convened. Time was officially on the agenda. For the first time in history, humanity attempted to legislate duration. The proposal was naive, a global limit on temporal stabilization, monitoring, transparency, equal access. No enforcement mechanism. Time, it turned out, did not care for treaties. The real conflict emerged elsewhere: military applications. If troops could experience longer planning windows, if commanders could think while battles unfolded slowly, if reaction time could be artificially expanded, time itself became terrain. The first classified engagement occurred in 2046. Two sides, one operating under mild temporal stabilization, the other not. The result was decisive, not because of better weapons, because one side had more moments. History recorded the outcome. Time recorded the cause. Elias Whitcomb's notebooks were declassified quietly that same year. Most people ignored them. One sentence circulated online anyway: "We have mistaken more time for more life." By 2049, a final realization set in among the remaining architects of Project Stillness. Slowing time did not create abundance, it concentrated it, and concentration creates imbalance. The clocks began behaving strangely again, not slowing, not jumping, but drifting apart, as if refusing to agree on whose time mattered.
Episode 8. When Time Stopped Agreeing. The first sign was small enough to dismiss. A satellite clock refused synchronization for 37 milliseconds longer than protocol allowed. Engineers blamed solar interference. The correction was forced. The system moved on. Then another satellite disagreed. Then 3. By the end of the month, global timekeeping systems were arguing with themselves, not failing, disagreeing. For over a century, humanity had worked tirelessly to make time uniform. Time zones, leap seconds, atomic standards, network protocols. Every layer existed to ensure that now meant the same thing everywhere. But now depended on where you were and who controlled your clocks. The problem was not accuracy. Atomic clocks were still perfect. The problem was context. Clocks embedded in stabilized environments reported one rhythm. Clocks in high-stress, high-density zones reported another. Neither was wrong. Both were real. Time had fractured into local truths. At first, the differences were negligible. Milliseconds here, microseconds there. But modern systems were built on those margins. Financial markets glitched. Autonomous systems hesitated. Navigation drifted. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. Enough to expose a deeper flaw. Synchronization required trust, and trust was gone. The International Time Coordination Council convened an emergency session. Their mandate was clear: re-establish a single global time standard. Their mistake was assuming time still wanted one. Project Stillness, what remained of it, issued a quiet warning. They had seen this before, not in records, in theory. If time behaved like a compressible medium, then uneven pressure would cause shear, and shear causes fracture. In 2051, the first temporal exclusion zone was acknowledged publicly. No one used the phrase at first. They called it a persistent synchronization anomaly in a dense metropolitan corridor. What it meant was simple. Inside that zone, clocks could not reliably agree with clocks outside. Signals crossed the boundary late or early depending on direction.
people experienced duration differently. Not enough to notice day to day, enough to change outcomes. Air traffic was rerouted, markets adjusted, governments denied permanence. The zone did not shrink, it stabilized. The public response fractured along familiar lines. Some demanded access, others demanded shutdown, a few demanded isolation. Time, once abstract, had become territorial. Then came the desynchronization event. On June 3, 2054, during a period of unusually high global data traffic, several major time servers failed simultaneously, not mechanically, but logically. They could not agree on sequence. Event A preceded Event B in one region, Event B preceded Event A in another. Causality wobbled. Only briefly, but briefly was enough. The human brain is exceptionally good at ignoring impossible things until they persist. Reports surfaced, phone calls answered before they rang, messages time-stamped minutes into the future, security footage that showed actions before causes. Most were explained away, some could not be. The regulators, deep underground, behaved differently. They stopped correcting, as if opting out, as if neutrality were no longer possible. A surviving member of Project Stillness wrote the final internal memo. It was never classified. No one bothered. Time is no longer a backdrop. It is a participant, and it is withdrawing cooperation. By 2056, synchronization failures were common enough that systems adapted. Local time became acceptable. Regional now replaced global now. The internet fractured into latency islands. Financial systems slowed deliberately. Speed was no longer an advantage, it was a liability. Something unexpected happened then. People adapted faster than machines. Without universal synchronization, life became less frantic. Schedules softened, deadlines loosened. The constant pressure to keep up faded. In some regions, time felt human again. But the cost was enormous. Scientific experiments failed. Space missions required unprecedented margins. Coordination across distances became fragile. Humanity had traded efficiency for coherence. And still, the clocks drifted. Not randomly, purposefully, as if searching for a configuration that reduced strain. In 2059, an old document resurfaced online. Elias Whitcomb's first notebook, the one that should have been destroyed. The opening line spread quietly, then everywhere. Time reacted before matter did. People began to ask the wrong question. Not what is time doing, but why.
Episode 9. Why Time Let Go. The mistake humanity made was assuming time was breaking. It wasn't. It was leaving. When Elias Whitcomb first noticed delta T slowing before the San Francisco earthquake, he believed time was reacting to stress the way metal reacts to heat, bendable, measurable, ultimately obedient. What he never wrote, what he only circled and underlined and never dared state plainly, was the implication. If time could react, then time could choose. That idea had been dismissed for a century as poetic nonsense, until the clocks stopped agreeing. The breakthrough came not from physics, but from an archivist. Her name was Mary Ann Kessler, and she worked in what remained of the Naval Observatory's Historical Records Division. Her job was unglamorous: digitize old notebooks before paper decay erased them forever. She found Whitcomb's missing ledger by accident. It wasn't cataloged as time research. It was cataloged as personal reflections, which meant no one had read it carefully. On page 417, buried beneath hand-drawn escapement diagrams, was a paragraph Whitcomb had crossed out so aggressively the paper nearly tore. Modern imaging recovered it anyway. We assume time exists everywhere equally, but clocks do not measure time. They measure change. If change becomes unsustainable, time may reduce participation rather than fail. What we call slowing may be withdrawal. Withdrawal.
Not compression, not distortion, refusal. Marianne sent the scan to a physicist she trusted. He sent it to another. Within weeks, a quiet consensus formed among people who had stopped believing in coincidence. Time was not a dimension like space. It was a process, and processes could disengage. The final model was terrifyingly simple. Time emerged where change could be resolved. Cause followed effect because time agreed to maintain order. But when systems became too dense, too fast, too recursive, too emotionally loaded, resolution failed. Time could no longer keep sequence clean, so it stepped back. Localized time was not slowing, it was thinning. This explained everything. Why atomic clocks remained accurate but irrelevant. Why subjective time collapsed. Why synchronization failed not randomly but selectively. Time was prioritizing regions of lower stress, lower informational density, lower violence. It was not punishing humanity, it was conserving itself. The most disturbing discovery followed. Time withdrawal was self-reinforcing. As time thinned, coordination failed. As coordination failed, stress increased. As stress increased, time withdrew further. A feedback loop, not infinite, terminal. The choice humanity faced was never about controlling time. It was about becoming tolerable to it again. A summit convened in 2061, not political, existential. Scientists, historians, systems engineers, psychologists, urban planners. No military, no corporations, no time pressure. Literally, they met in a region where clocks barely drifted. The proposal was radical. Not slow time artificially, not redistribute stabilized zones, but reduce the conditions that drove time away. Less speed, less simultaneity, less forced optimization, more pauses, more silence, more sequence. It sounded like regression. It wasn't. It was adaptation. Pilot regions volunteered. They dismantled real-time markets, introduced mandatory latency, disconnected global feeds, reintroduced night. Time responded. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. The clocks stabilized. People inside those regions reported something unfamiliar. Boredom, then relief, then depth. Time didn't feel long, it felt present. The data confirmed it. Time density increased. Synchronization became possible again. Not global, but regional, negotiated. The final revelation came from the regulators themselves. They were no longer drifting, they were aligning, selectively, as if time were willing to cooperate again, conditionally. The last entry in Whitcomb's recovered notes was finally understood. Time is not ours to spend, it is ours to deserve. Humanity had one chance, not to master time, but to slow itself enough to be allowed back in.
Episode 10. The Time That Stayed. History will never record the moment humanity chose to slow down. There was no vote, no treaty, no declaration broadcast across fractured networks. The choice revealed itself the way all real changes do, through behavior. People stopped asking how to get more time. They started asking what was worth keeping. The regions where time had thinned the most did not collapse first. They faded. Coordination failed. Markets fractured. Global simultaneity, once civilization's proudest trick, became unsustainable. Systems adapted by letting go. And in letting go, they discovered something unexpected. Time returned. The effort was uneven. Some nations resisted. Some accelerated, hoping to outrun the withdrawal. They did not succeed. Time does not chase. It waits. Where speed was reduced intentionally, clocks stabilized naturally. Where information flow was limited, sequence returned. Where people slept, paused, and allowed boredom back into their lives, time thickened again. Not slower, just present. Project Stillness was officially dissolved for the final time in 2068. Its archives were released publicly. Most people never read them.
they didn't need to. The lesson had already escaped the documents. The stabilized facilities were dismantled. The regulators were not destroyed. They were retired, placed in museums that measured nothing. No one tried to rebuild Delta T. The clock that slowed down time had served its purpose. It had warned. Elias Whitcomb never became famous. His name appears once in a footnote in a declassified report. A clockmaker, an immigrant, a man who listened carefully. That was enough. By the end of the century, atomic clocks still defined the second, but life no longer obeyed them blindly. Schedules widened, deadlines softened, silence regained value. Time was no longer optimized, it was inhabited. Children born into this world would never know the frantic compression their grandparents called normal. They would experience days that held shape, moments that ended naturally, a future that did not feel stolen before it arrived. Time did not return because humanity demanded it. It returned because humanity became compatible with it again. Somewhere, in a quiet museum, Elias Whitcomb's original notebook rests behind glass. The final line is underlined, not circled. Time stayed when we learned how to stay too. And the clocks? They still tick, but now they listen back.